They worked the fields barefoot, lived with animals, and feared death daily. And yet, they were calmer, healthier, and rarely alone. Imagine eating fresh food, resting midday, and spending evenings with friends instead of scrolling alone in bed. That was everyday life in the Middle Ages. Today you will learn why medieval life, though filled with hardship, offered deeper rest, stronger communities, healthier bodies, and a clearer sense of purpose than much of modern existence. Dear viewers, my big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you subscribe, I'll keep creating even more fascinating and unique videos about life in the Middle Ages. And with your support, we'll get closer to that goal. I'm truly grateful to everyone who's helped me along the way. Now let's move into today's video. When one imagines a medieval peasant, the mind often conjures a figure bent under the sun, hands thick with soil and clothes stiff with sweat, working tirelessly from dawn to dusk, with little rest or reward. Yet this image, though partially true in its physical harshness, conceals a quieter reality. One in which labor, though constant and necessary, did not consume the mind, the soul, or the calendar in the way modern work so often does. Beneath the weight of the seasons and the church bells, medieval life pulsed with pauses, with intervals of stillness, festivity, and reprieve that most modern workers would scarcely believe. The key to this rhythm lay in the intertwining of the agricultural year with the sacred calendar. Work did not unfold in a steady grind. There was no uniformity in hours or expectations across the seasons. Spring meant sowing, summer the long, hot days of weeding and harvesting, and autumn the gathering of grain and fruit. Yet even at the height of the farming year, work remained human-scaled, interrupted by morning rest, a long midday meal often followed by a nap, and a slower pace once the sun began to fall. Winter, with its frozen earth and shortened days, brought a natural slowing. Indoors, repairs were made, tools sharpened, and stories passed down by firelight, rather than time burned beneath fluorescent bulbs or spent in traffic jams. This unhurried rhythm was not merely a luxury. It was a necessity born of a world still tied to the body and the sky. No one could command the soil to yield faster or force animals to grow on a schedule. And so the peasant worked not by stopwatch, but by instinct, by weather, and by tradition, guided by cycles far older than any written rule. The earth itself dictated when to labor and when to wait, and within that organic framework, people learned to listen, to pace themselves, and to rest without guilt. The feast days, too, were not idle holidays in the modern sense, but moments when the sacred and the communal became one. A wedding, a baptism, a church consecration, or a traveling fair was cause enough to lay down the plow or leave the forge. These events did not interrupt the flow of life. They were part of its pulse. They reaffirmed community bonds, allowed time for joy and storytelling, and reminded even the poorest laborer that life was not meant to be endured in isolation, but shared and celebrated whenever possible. What distinguished medieval labor most sharply from its modern counterpart was not merely the quantity of hours, but the quality of time itself. Time was slow, uneven, and forgiving. It bent to accommodate hunger, weather, fatigue, and even mood. The peasant could pause, sit in the shade, take a drink, or nap in the afternoon grass without shame. Such moments were not wasted, but woven naturally into the fabric of the day, just as silence is part of music. After the harvest, it was not uncommon for villagers to enjoy several weeks of relative rest, their stores full, the days shorter, the fields asleep. In this lull, they repaired roofs, prepared firewood, and visited family. The work continued, but its pace had shifted. No quarterly deadlines pressed, no emails awaited a reply. The mind, like the soil, was given time to lie fallow. This deep integration of rest and labor, of celebration and work, created a life where physical exhaustion existed. But mental exhaustion was rare. The absence of artificial urgency, of mechanical repetition, and of the constant presence of distant demands meant that even the poorest medieval laborer might have known more peace than the modern office worker. Though his muscles ached and his hands were calloused, his mind was not chained to a screen or haunted by to-do lists. He worked with the earth, and when the work paused, so did he, without anxiety. As the bells marked time from the church tower, they did not urge haste, but signaled rhythm. The Angelus at noon reminded the village to stop, reflect, and breathe. Work was not an identity, nor a metric of human worth. It was a necessity. The medieval table, though bare by modern standards, held a surprising abundance of what truly nourished the body. There were no superfoods, no nutritional supplements, no glossy cookbooks guiding elaborate meals. Only the earth, the season, and the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The diet of a common peasant, formed not by preference but necessity, consisted almost entirely of what could be grown, foraged, brewed, or preserved by hand. And yet within these limitations, it sustained bodies that labored 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. And it did so without the chronic diseases that plague our own time. A peasant's day might begin with coarse, dark bread baked from stone-ground grains, often barley or rye, their rough crusts cracked from the hearth. Alongside it, a porridge of oats or peas, thickened overnight and flavored with herbs or wild onions, formed the core of the meal. Vegetables, cabbage, leeks, turnips, or beans, dominated the diet, cooked slowly in clay pots over open flames. Protein was scarce but not absent. Small pieces of salted pork, a smoked fish, or an egg from the family hen might appear on special days or in times of good fortune. All of it was washed down with weak ale or small beer, brewed not for intoxication but for safety, as the water in many places could not be trusted. Modern science has begun to cast a curious eye backward and found that this seemingly meager fare offered a nutritional profile far closer to what physicians now recommend than most supermarket shelves provide. Low in sugar, high in fiber, built upon whole grains and legumes, the medieval diet was naturally anti-inflammatory, heart-protective, and rich in the slow-burning calories necessary for sustained physical effort. British physician Roger Henderson noted that this ancient way of eating, shaped by hardship and custom, likely contributed to lower risks of heart disease and diabetes, conditions rampant in the post-industrial world yet virtually unknown in the pre-modern one. The paradox is striking. A peasant consuming 3,500 calories daily, nearly 2 whole loaves of bread, cups of beans or peas, and tankards of ale carried no extra weight. Their bodies, hardened by movement and exposure, burned through every mouthful with ease. Obesity, now a global epidemic, did not exist in the medieval village. Illness came from infection or famine, not from overindulgence. The body was kept lean not by discipline, but by design. Even sugar, the modern tyrant of tooth and metabolism, played no role in most people's lives. It was an exotic luxury, transported from far-off lands at tremendous cost, and tasted by few outside the nobility. For the ordinary man or woman, sweetness came only from fruit in season or the occasional spoonful of honey, a richness reserved for celebration. There were no candies, no sodas, no pastries glazed in syrup. Children did not sip from cartons or chew fluorescent gums. Their teeth, though unbrushed, decayed far more slowly than ours, and their palates, untrained in artificial pleasure, found joy in simpler tastes. What these meals lacked in variety, they made up for in rhythm and ritual. Food was grown nearby, eaten fresh, and consumed in community. Meals marked the structure of the day and provided space for rest, laughter, and storytelling. In a world without screens or solitude, people gathered close at mealtimes, not to post or scroll, but to share warmth and flavor. And that sharing, mundane as it seemed, reinforced bonds that would carry them through sickness, harvest, and grief. Seasonality, now a culinary trend, was once a fact of life. There were no strawberries in December, no preserved tomatoes in glass jars on frosted windowsills. In spring, people ate young greens and wild herbs. In summer, the gardens gave abundance: onions, peas, beans, lettuce, and more. Autumn brought root vegetables and nuts, apples and cabbage to be pickled for winter. The hunger gap, a quiet stretch before the first growth of spring, taught discipline and made the first shoots taste sweeter. Preservation was an art: drying, salting, fermenting, or storing in cool cellars. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was fast. This simplicity did not equal perfection. There were years when crops failed, when bread was stretched with bark or acorns, when bellies ached with hunger and children grew thin. But when food was abundant, it was real, untouched by additives, emulsifiers, preservatives, or industrial processing. What grew was eaten, and what was eaten gave strength. Illness came not from overeating, but from misfortune. No hidden sugar lurked behind harmless labels. No plastic packaging outlasted the meal. Life was physical, and so was hunger. And satiety, when it came, felt full and honest. Peasants may not have spoken in terms of clean eating or organic produce, but they lived it every day. In the medieval village, no one truly lived alone. Stone by stone and day by day, the lives of its inhabitants were woven into something denser than family, deeper than friendship, a net of shared burdens and blessings that cradled even the weakest in times of need. The rhythms of birth, work, celebration, and death were not private events. They belonged to everyone. In one thatched-roof cottage, 3 generations might sleep under a single ceiling, and just beyond its door, neighbors passed without knocking, their presence so familiar it left no trace of intrusion. The world outside may have been dangerous and unpredictable, but within the village, a quiet solidarity reigned. It was not a utopia, nor was it always kind. Tempers flared, and rivalries brewed like the ale in the common room. But against the backdrop of scarcity and uncertainty, cooperation was not simply a virtue, it was a form of survival. When a barn needed raising, the village came. When wheat stood ready for harvest, arms from every house reached for the scythe. And when illness entered a home, others brought broth, warmth, and watchful care, knowing that the misfortunes of one could swiftly become the misfortunes of many. Help was not requested. It was assumed. To withdraw from the fabric of the village was to unravel a portion of its strength. Within these tight circles, privacy was scarce, but warmth was abundant. Shared fires, shared meals, and shared work created lives so interconnected that solitude, as modern people understand it, scarcely existed. Evenings rarely passed in silence. When daylight faded and tools were hung, neighbors gathered around common tasks, plucking feathers, weaving baskets, or repairing worn garments, while voices filled the room with stories, songs, and the laughter of children nestled at their mother's feet. These gatherings, lit by flame and thick with the smell of smoke and stew, were more than leisure. They were rituals of belonging. The village was not the only stage for such kinship. In towns and cities, craft guilds and trade associations performed a similar role, offering security, fellowship, and a structure of mutual responsibility that blurred the line between profession and family. A carpenter or a cobbler was not an isolated laborer, but part of a brotherhood that would defend his rights, train his sons, and bury him with dignity. One's trade was a doorway to identity, and within each guild hall echoed the same sense of rootedness found among the fields. Even religious life reinforced this unity. Each Sunday, the bells summoned rich and poor alike beneath the vaulted arches of the parish church, where all stood as equals before God. And at festivals, the great wheel of saints' days, harvest feasts, and processions, the divisions between households faded completely. Dressed in garlands or masks, the village became one organism, moving in rhythm, celebrating not wealth or status, but the miracle of survival. The turning of time, the generosity of earth and heaven alike. Children absorbed these values from their first breath. They were not raised behind closed doors, but within the village itself, held by many arms, scolded by many voices, and praised by many hearts. Their games, played in dust and meadow, mirrored the work of adults, pretending to herd, to bake, to sew. Their imaginations were not shaped by distant images, but by the lived reality around them. The carpenter's tools, the spinning wheel, the birth of lambs in spring. Each child belonged to everyone, and each old woman, no matter how bent or blind, held a place at the fire. This communal world was far from idyllic. Jealousies sparked quarrels. Scarcity could breed suspicion. But the structure itself, close quarters, shared needs, and a culture of reciprocity, acted as a buffer against the emotional starvation that so often afflicts the modern soul. Loneliness, that silent affliction of cities and screens, had no real soil in which to grow. One might grieve or despair, but rarely in isolation. A neighbor's ear, a priest's counsel, or a stranger's simple presence at one's doorstep reminded each person, "You are seen. You are part of something." Even architecture reflected this ethos. Homes were clustered close together, their rooftops nearly touching. Fields were worked in common, not parceled into private acres. The village square was a heart that beat for everyone. Marketplace, meeting ground, stage for music, justice, and rumor alike. And when night fell, the low glow of fires flickered from dozens of windows, each a soft signal of shared endurance, like stars strung low across the earth. To modern eyes, this lack of solitude might seem suffocating. But for those whose lives were ruled by the uncertainty of harvests and the nearness of death, it was comforting to know that no hardship would ever be borne alone. The collective strength of the village was not merely a backdrop to medieval life. It was its foundation. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in constant dialogue with the land. Beneath bare feet or coarse sandals, the soil was not a backdrop to life, but its silent partner, supplying, testing, humbling. The rhythms of each day and season were dictated not by the hands of a clock or the signals of a phone, but by the position of the sun, the cry of birds at dawn, and the changing scent of the air. In this world, nature was not visited for leisure, nor romanticized in poetry. It was lived, touched, feared, and revered, moment by moment. From the narrow paths between fields to the dense edges of untamed forest, the medieval landscape shaped not only the peasants' labor, but also their soul. Trees stood not as scenery, but as landmarks, protectors, and sometimes threats. Rivers were lifelines, but also carried risk of floods, fevers, or things unseen beneath their surface. The sky offered both light and omen. When clouds thickened and winds moaned through the rafters, villagers paused, reading the signs, adjusting their plans in reverence to forces far greater than themselves. This deep attentiveness, born from necessity, forged a kind of intimacy with the natural world that few modern minds can replicate. After sunset, this bond only deepened. Without lamps or neon haze, darkness fell swiftly and completely, interrupted only by flickering torches, oil lamps, or the weak orange glow of the hearth. Yet in that darkness, the sky awakened. The Milky Way stretched clearly from horizon to horizon, its thousands of stars unblurred by smoke or pollution. Children grew up recognizing constellations as companions, and farmers read the heavens not for metaphor, but instruction. The moon's phases guided sowing and harvesting, while the rising of particular stars signaled coming rains, coming cold, or coming death. Sleep itself followed these cues. Without artificial light to bend time to their will, villagers rose with the cock's cry and retired not long after dusk. Their rest, divided sometimes into two phases with a waking hour in between, was slow and unforced, aligned with the natural drift of their bodies. This biorhythmic life, early rest, gentle waking, offered a kind of mental clarity and peace that modern sleep-deprived routines can rarely match. No screens shimmered in bedrooms. No horns or sirens shattered the stillness. Night was not feared, but accepted like winter, a time of pause, of shelter, of inward turning. Even the home, which might appear to shelter from nature, was partially an extension of it. Many cottages housed not just people but animals, whose heat and presence were as much a part of daily life as bread and prayer. The lowing of a cow in the next room or the rustle of chickens beneath a raised floor were not nuisances. They were normal, even comforting. Life and death were not sealed off behind closed doors. They walked alongside the family, part of the same breathing, sweating, freezing, growing whole. Nature's gifts and cruelties were understood not through abstract terms like weather patterns or natural disasters, but as immediate sensory events. A late frost meant hunger. A swarm of locusts meant loss. A season of gentle rains meant survival. And in this fragile balance, people developed not mastery over nature, but humility before it. They bowed to its rhythms and prayed not for control, but for mercy. Their gods lived in the forests, their saints in the sky. And when misfortune struck, it was not interpreted as meaningless. It was a warning, a judgment, or a test. Still, with all its hardship, the natural world also offered wonder and sanctuary. Meadows rich with wildflowers became places for children's games and lovers' meetings. Forest glades, alive with birdsong, held medicinal herbs and sacred groves. Waterfalls carved paths through rock, and each hill might cradle a legend of a giant's footprint, a saint's resting place, or a miracle whispered long ago by firelight. These stories were not myths in the distant sense. They were maps, passed from tongue to tongue, helping people navigate not just terrain, but meaning. The ecological footprint of medieval life, though unintentional, was almost non-existent. There were no engines, no plastics, no factories pumping soot into the air. Fires were fed with wood gathered over time, not extracted in haste. Clothes were patched, mended, and passed down through generations. Waste fed animals returned to the soil, or was simply done without. The idea of throwing something away did not exist because there was no away. Everything belonged to the same slow, sacred cycle. To understand the medieval soul, one must first understand that faith was not a belief worn on holy days, but a constant presence, woven into the breath, the heartbeat, and the soil beneath the feet. In a world that offered few guarantees and was shadowed by death, disease, and misfortune, the idea of a life beyond suffering was not only comforting, but essential. Christianity, in its medieval form, did not merely promise salvation. It gave structure to chaos, meaning to hardship, and dignity to lives that might otherwise have seemed small and fleeting. The church was not a distant institution. It stood at the center of each town and village, its bells marking time, its walls bearing witness to every birth, union, and passing. From the smallest chapel to the grandest cathedral, the house of God was both literal and symbolic, a stone anchor in a world where famine could arrive with the same swiftness as war. The teachings of the church, the sermons of local priests, and the words of wandering friars offered explanations for life's sorrows that were not cynical or empty, but deeply rooted in a shared moral and cosmic order. The idea that earthly life was a test, a brief passage of toil before eternal peace, provided a framework that made suffering not only bearable, but redemptive. Pain, hunger, and grief were not punishments without purpose. They were trials of the soul, each one an opportunity to grow closer to God. Death, ever near, was not a final defeat, but a threshold. Those who lived righteously could expect reward, reunion with lost loved ones, release from suffering, and joy everlasting in the presence of the divine. This vision of paradise, vivid and specific, often took the shape of a heavenly banquet, an eternal springtime, or a reunion beyond the veil. The images were not abstract. They were painted on church walls, chanted in hymns, and recounted in tales told by firelight. Heaven was not distant. It hovered just out of reach, drawing the weary forward with the promise of rest and reunion. In this way, hope became not a vague sentiment, but a lifeline as real as bread or fire. Beyond the hope of salvation, faith also offered clear direction. The Ten Commandments, the lives of saints, and the moral codes embedded in Scripture shaped not only individual choices, but community expectations. People knew what was right, what was forbidden, what was sacred. This clarity, though sometimes rigid, gave order to lives otherwise marked by uncertainty. A poor farmer might have no wealth, no education, and no voice in distant courts, but he knew his place in the divine plan, and that knowledge granted him purpose. Religious rituals created rhythm and continuity across the year. From Lent's fasting to Easter's jubilation, from the solemnity of All Souls' Day to the wild merriment of the midwinter feasts, life unfolded through sacred cycles that mirrored nature's own turning. Every rite, whether private prayer or public procession, reminded the believer that they were not alone in their struggle. Saints had once walked these same muddy paths. Christ had suffered hunger, betrayal, and pain. The Virgin had wept. This shared suffering bound heaven and earth together. Even the harshest of events, a child's death, a failed harvest, the plague's sudden arrival, were, through faith, given context. The pain was no less real, but it was cradled in meaning. People did not have to pretend joy. They could grieve openly, pray aloud, and take comfort in ritual. A candle lit in memory, a mass sung for the dead, or a cross traced on the forehead were small but potent gestures in the face of vast despair. They kept despair from becoming silence. For the individual, prayer was both surrender and empowerment. It required no literacy, no wealth, no intermediaries. A whispered Ave Maria, a worn rosary, a plea muttered before a field's first plow, all were valid and all were heard. In prayer, even the most voiceless found voice, and the most powerless found a way to speak to power beyond this world. Faith also encouraged virtues that enriched communal life. Mercy, patience, humility, and generosity were not merely praised. They were taught, practiced, and expected. A neighbor's suffering was not theirs alone. To feed the hungry, clothe the poor, visit the sick, these were not optional acts of kindness, but sacred duties. The spiritual and the social were not separate realms, they were fused. The Middle Ages, in all their hardship and harsh beauty, were never a golden age. Behind every quiet village lay the threat of famine, the pain of illness, and the cold touch of war or death. Yet for all the suffering, something in that world breathed with a steadiness we struggle to replicate. It was not the comfort of certainty, nor the ease of material wealth, but a balance, a rhythm between labor and rest, between isolation and kinship, between fear and faith, that gave ordinary people a framework in which to survive and, often, to find joy. Modern life, by contrast, has brought us further than the medieval world could have imagined. Vaccines, electricity, literacy, freedom of thought and movement, these are triumphs worth defending. And yet, in the pursuit of progress, something essential has been worn thin. Our calendars are filled, but our hearts remain restless. Our homes grow larger, but our tables feel emptier. Loneliness, anxiety, and exhaustion are no longer rare, they are expected. And the further we run toward the future, the more we seem to long for what was left behind. From the peasant's worn hands, we inherit no devices, no great monuments, no libraries of philosophy. But we inherit a model for another kind of strength, one born of resilience, simplicity, and belonging. They worked not for profit margins, but for survival. They rested not as reward, but as necessity. Their families were not scheduled into weekends or text threads. They were constant, embodied presences. Meals were not consumed, but shared. Time was not managed, it was followed. There was no wellness industry to speak of, but there was wellness, physical, emotional, and spiritual, born of movement, closeness, and meaning. A man who labored in the fields might have ended his day with aching muscles, but he slept under stars undimmed by artificial light, with the sound of animals breathing beside him and the knowledge that tomorrow would come shaped by the same familiar rituals. This was not nostalgia, nor delusion. It was acceptance of limits, of cycles, of vulnerability. A bad harvest brought hunger, not outrage. A funeral brought sorrow, not existential crisis. People did not expect life to be easy or fair. They did not seek perpetual happiness. They sought steadiness, and when they found it, in the rhythms of the land, the arms of kin, or the words of prayer, they held it close. Perhaps the greatest difference lies in expectations. Where the medieval peasant asked for survival, today's mind demands fulfillment, excitement, and transcendence, all delivered without pain. But the more we expect, the more we suffer in the absence of perfection. The medieval world, grounded in hardship, taught contentment in moments, warm bread, laughter by firelight, a single good harvest. Their joy was not constant, but it was real. None of this means we should return. No one would trade antibiotics for alchemy, nor choose a world without anesthesia or clean water. But as we continue forward, perhaps we must glance back, not to imitate, but to remember. The past offers no solutions, only perspective. And from that vantage, we might begin to rebuild the parts of ourselves that progress has quietly eroded. To reclaim community, not through apps, but through presence. To find rest not in entertainment, but in slowness. To treat nature not as resource, but as companion. To see food not as fuel, but as a ceremony. And to face uncertainty not with terror, but with patience, reverence, and, above all, a sense of belonging in a world that moves whether or not we try to control it. There is wisdom in hardship, if we choose to see it. The Middle Ages knew it well. With little, they made enough. With fear, they found faith. With silence, they found rhythm. To live as they did would be impossible. But to learn from their balance, to rediscover the beauty of limits, and to embrace the small, durable joys of a slower world, this remains within our reach. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember, then let it not end here. Share it, speak of it, and above all, carry forward what is worth preserving.